Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Literature with Preeti Raj. In today's lecture, we are going to begin with a very basic but extremely important topic. What is literary movement? As a student of literature, we frequently come across terms such as Romanticism, Classicism, Modernism, Surrealism, or Metaphysical Poets, and we often memorize their dates, features, and major writers for examination. But before studying individual movements, we first need to understand what the term literary movement it actually means. In this lecture, we will discuss how writers become connected through shared ideas, themes, styles, and artistic goals. We will also understand how literary movements it emerged, why we study them, and how scholars recognize the common literary pattern. We will then examine an interesting question. We give a literary movement its name. So, who is the one who gives it? Is it named by the writers themselves, or is it the label that is given by the critics or the historians? We will also discuss whether the literary movements have clearly fixed dates and how the literary movement it differs from a broader literary age or a period. So this topic will help you build a strong foundation for studying the major literary movements that are frequently asked in your examination. And instead of just simply memorizing the names and the dates, we will be able to understand the logic that is behind these classifications. And then we will place these writers and texts within their proper literary context. So let us begin by answering the very first question. What exactly is a literary movement? A literary movement is a broad trend in literature. It refers to a group of writers or literary works that share certain common features. Now, these similarities may appear in their ideas, themes, writing style, philosophies, techniques, or artistic goals. So, the writers associated with the literary movement they usually belong to the same historical period. Since they live under the similar social, political, as well as cultural and also intellectual conditions, they often respond to many of the same issues. Their works may reflect similar concern about society, religion, politics, human nature, identity, or artistic expression. However, this does not mean that every writer within a movement writer is exactly the same way. Each writer or author has an individual voice and may interpret the shared concerns very differently. A literary movement simply it helps us to recognize the larger pattern that is there that connects their work. So when a critic identifies a literary movement they're actually looking at the common ideas and the techniques that appear across the works of several writers. These shared features it actually allows us to study literature not only as a separate text but also as a part of a wider historical and cultural development. Next is, do writers write the movements then do write next is, do writers in a literary movement have to know each other? Now, when we say that the writers they belong to the same literary movement, it does not mean that they must come from the same place or have the same personal background. Now, these writers may belong to different regions, social classes, or cultural environment. Their life experiences may be very different. They may never meet or identify themselves as the member of the same group. So, what connects them is not necessarily who they are personally but what we actually find in their writings. So they may choose similar subjects, present those subjects in similar ways, or share a particular understanding of what literature should be. So they may also have similar artistic intentions or respond to society in a comparable way. So, a literary movement is formed through shared literary tendencies. Okay, so the connection, it lies mainly in the writer's idea, their methods, concern, and creative choices, not simply in their nationality or class or personal identity. So this is why two writers who never met each other may still be studied as a part of the same literary movement if their works, they reveal something which is, having the same important similarities. Now, let us understand how these literary movement actually emerged. A literary movement does not appear suddenly or without any reason. It is usually, it happens because within a particular historical and a cultural context, writers, they respond to the world around them, and changes in the society often influence the subject they chose and the way they are writing it. For example, political changes may lead the writers to question the authority, freedom, power, or national identities. Social conflicts may bring attending to class or gender equality or injustice. Political changes, for example, may lead writers to question the authority, freedom, power, or national identity. So, social conflict may bring attention of class, gender, inequality, or injustice. Religious developments can shape the ideas about faith, morality, doubt, and human existence. Scientific discoveries may also change the way the people understand the world. During the Victorian period, if we see, for instance, new scientific ideas, it created a lot of tension between the traditional religious beliefs and the modern thought. So this conflict, it appeared in the works of many writers of that time. Cultural transformation also plays a very important role. The growth of cities, industrialization, war, education, or new technologies can produce new literary themes and techniques. Modernist writers, for example, they experimented with fragmented forms, partly because they were responding to the uncertainties and the disruption of the modern world. Literary movement also emerged through their relationship with earlier traditions. uh, a new movement may continue some older ideas, modify them, or reject them completely. So the Renaissance writers, they revived the cultural Greek and Roman learning, while the later neoclassical writers, they adapted the classical principles of order, balance, and discipline. So if we say that the literary movement, it develops through a continuous interaction between literature, history, and society, and also the earlier literary traditions that were there. They help us see how the writers, they actually respond creatively to the changing world that was around them. Now, next question arises, why do we study this literary movement? We study literary movement because they help us understand literature as a part of larger historical and cultural process. A literary work is not created in isolation. It often reflects the changing ideas about human life, society, culture, politics, and artistic expression. Literary movement also helps us to see how one period it responds to another. A new movement may question, modify, or reject the values of the earlier tradition. For example, Romantic writers. They placed greater emphasis on emotion, imagination, individuality, and nature. In the same way, this was a response to the Enlightenment, whose strong emphasis was on reason, order, and scientific thinking. So, by studying the literary movements, we can identify the common pattern that was there among the writers and understand how literary styles and ideas change over time. So, they also helps us to place the individual authors within a broader literary history. However, we should also remember that a literary movement is only a framework. It should not become a rigid label. Every writer has an individual voice, and not every author follows all the features that were associated with that particular movement. So, literary movement, it helps us to organize and understand the literary history, but it also should not limit our interpretation of an individual writer or a text. Now, literary movement also helps us to give a very practical way to study and organize the literature. First, they help us to understand the historical and cultural background of a literary work. So, once we know the period in which the writers were working, we can better understand the ideas, concerns, and pressures that shaped the text. They also help us to recognize the recurring themes, the style, the techniques. So when a similar pattern it appears in the work of several writers, we can see that these are not isolated choices but part of a larger literary tendency. So studying these movements also makes comparison more easier. We can compare writers from same period and notice both their similarities and their individual differences. Literary movements further helps us to observe how their literary taste and the thought change over time. A style that is admired in one period may be questioned or rejected in another. So, they also allow us to trace the development of literary traditions, how one generation of a writer inherits, modifies, or challenges the works of earlier writers. Most importantly, they help us to appreciate the diversity of literature. Different movements, they show us the writers from different periods and cultures have understood that human experiences in a very different way. So the study of literary movement, it helps us to connect the individual text to a wider history of literature. Now, let us understand what we mean by the literary pattern and how do scholars actually identify a literary movement. When several writers they repeatedly use similar techniques or explore the similar concern, scholars now begin to notice a pattern in their work. Their similarities may appear in a poetic form. They use the imagery they prefer, the questions they arise, or the theme they return to again and again. For example, a group of writers may show a strong interest in nature, religious faith, social inequality, individual freedom, or the conflict between reason and emotion. They may also use similar symbols, the narrative methods, or poetic structures. Now, these patterns, they do not mean that the writers are identical. Rather, they show that the certain ideas and the artistic choices were specially important during that particular period. So, scholars also study the historical conditions surrounding these writers and examine whether they are responding to similar cultural or intellectual development. So, by recognizing such patterns, scholars can identify the dominant literary tendencies of an age and understand how different writers were responding to similar intellectual, social, or cultural concerns. Now, let us also talk about who names these literary movements. Literary movements are not always named in the very same way. In the same cases, the writers themselves, in some cases, if we see the writers themselves, they choose a name for their movement. They may openly declare their shared ideas, publish manifestos, or identify themselves as a part of new artistic group. In such cases, the names become a form of self identification. In other cases, the writers may never use a common label for themselves. So, the critics, historians, or the later scholars may study their works, notice important similarities, and then place them under a shared category. So, the name of a literary movement may function as a critical label, a historical classification, or a retrospective society. Now, the word retrospective simply means that the label was, applied after the scholars looked back at the writers and their works. So, therefore, while studying any literary movement, we should also ask that whether the name was chosen by the writer themselves or was it given on by the later critics and historians. Now, let us look at the self identified literary movements. In some cases, as I already told you, writers consciously come together and present themselves as a part of a new movement. They clearly state what they believe, the literature or the art they talk about, and they also may explain how their work is different from the earlier traditions. So, such writers they often express their ideas through manifestos, critical essays, also literary journals, public statements, or shared artistic programs. These documents it help identify or define the aim and the principle of that movement. Surrealism is a very good example. The writers and artists they connected with surrealism, accepted and used the term themselves. Andre Breton explained many of its central ideas in Surrealist Manifesto. Surrealists were interested in dreams, the unconscious mind, imagination, and the forms of expression that moved beyond organic logic. So, in this case, the movement was not simply named later by the critic. Its members consciously identified themselves with it and publicly explained its artistic purpose. Futurism, again, was a consciously organized artistic literary movement. Its members they openly declared their principles through manifestos. Filippo Marinetti he published the Futurist Manifesto in 1909 and celebrating speed. Then he talked about technology, machines, energy, modern urban life. So futurist writers they deliberately rejected the older artistic traditions. If we talk about Imagism was also a self conscious literary movement that was formed by the poet in the early 20th century. Writers such as Ezra Pound, Hilda Doolittle, Richard Aldington, they all promoted clear, precise writing and direct treatment of the subject and freedom from unnecessary words. Their principles were explained through essays, statements, and literary publication. Like Surrealism, both Futurism and Imagism were movements whose members actively defined and promoted their own artistic ideas. With that, also comment down that who is known as the father of Imagism. Now, next is that movements that were named by the critics and the historians. So many literary movements were not formally created by the writers associated with them, but actually the writers did not actually meet also as a group, publish any manifestos or describe themselves by any common name. Instead, what happened? Later critics and historians they studied their works, noticed important similarities, and grouped them together under one literary label. Romanticism, for example. So, writers such as Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, they did not belong to an officially organized school called as Romantic movement. However, the critics they later on recognized the common features in their works, such as an emphasis on imagination, emotion, nature, individuality and creative freedom also. So the term romanticism was therefore applied retrospectively. This means that the writers were grouped together after the scholars identified some shared themes, concerns, and literary techniques in their works. Next example is metaphysical poets. Writers such as Donne, Herbert, Andrew Marvell, they did not form any organized literary school. The label was applied later because critics noticed some common features in their poetry, including intellectual argument, wit, unusual comparison, and philosophical reflection. Again, another example could be confessional poetry. Poets such as Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, Anne Saxton, they did not formally establish a movement under their name. So the term was introduced by the critic M.L. Rosenthal to describe the poetry that dealt openly with personal experiences, psychological struggles, family relationship, and private emotions. One more example is the movement, a term that was used for the group of British poets of the 1950s, which included Philip Larkin, Kingsley Amis, Donald Davy. So, this name was introduced by the literary editor J.D. Scott after he noticed that there is some similarities in their clear language, restrained style, and rejection of excessive poetic experimentation. So these examples, they show that the critics, they create literary categories after identifying shared features among the writers who may never have considered themselves the members of the formal movement. Now, as students, we often try to memorize the dates of the literary movements because chronology based questions are common in the examination. Now, we are asked to arrange the movements, writers, or works in the correct order. So, dates naturally become very important for us. But this raises a very interesting question. But this raises a very interesting question. Are literary movements really so clearly defined that we place them between two exact dates? Not always, right? So, some movements are easier to identify because they have clear principles, major writers, or important texts that are associated with them. But there are many literary movements that overlap with earlier and later traditions. Literary change usually happens gradually. So, one movement does not suddenly end on a particular date, and another does not begin on the very next day. Older ideas may continue, while new styles and concerns slowly begin to appear. So, a writer may also show the influence of more than one movement. So, this is why the scholars sometimes disagree about the exact beginning and the ending of the literary period or about where a particular writer should be placed. So, for examination, dates are certainly useful and important, but while understanding literature, we should treat them as approximate boundaries rather than, completely fixed division. Literary movements are best understood as flexible frameworks that helps us recognize the dominant tendencies of that period. Now, next is, can a writer belong to two or more movements? Now, another important point is that writers may not fix completely into only one literary movement. A writer's idea and his style may change throughout his career. Some writers may change the influence of one movement, while others may reflect a different literary tradition. A writer may also accept certain features of a movement but reject others. So, this is why literary classification is not always simple or very definite. So, literary movement help us to understand the general pattern, but they should not be used as a rigid label. Individual writers are often complex than the categories in which we place them. Next comes a very a common confusion that we usually have. What is the difference between literary movement and a literary age? Students often use these two terms as if they mean the same thing. They are not exactly identical. A literary movement is more specific. It refers to a group of writers or works that are connected by shared themes, styles, techniques, philosophies, or artistic aims. A literary age, on the other hand, is much more broader. It is mainly a chronological division in literary history and may cover a long period of time. So, within one literary age, we may find several literary movements, different genres, contrasting styles, and many major and minor writers. Not all of them will write in the same way. For example, an age may include poetry, drama, prose, satire, religious writings, and several competing literary tendencies at the same time. So the easiest way to remember the difference is that literary age, it tells us when the writers were writing, while a literary movement, it actually tells us what common literary features connected them. In simple terms, the age is the larger historical frame, and the movement is more focused and literary pattern within that frame. So, in simple terms, in simple terms, the age is the larger historical frame, and the movement is more focused literary pattern within that frame. So, this brings us to the end of our discussion on what a literary movement actually is. I hope this lecture helped you to understand how literary movements are formed, why we study them, how are they named, and how they differ from the literary age. In the next class, we will begin discussing the major literary movements that are frequently asked about in the literature examination. So stay tuned and do not forget to like the video and subscribe to Literature with Preeti Raj. Thank you.